Protesters stormed the government in Baghdad, bringing renewed attention to unrest in Iraq. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi is under pressure as Iraqi security forces are called away from the front lines in the fight against ISIL to confront protesters in Iraq's Green Zone. The Green Zone is a secure area of Baghdad encompassing Iraq's high-level government officials. Protesters breach that zone in these ongoing protests and are demanding government action. For the latest, we're joined now by CCTV's Sean Calebs. And Sean, protests had slowed down a bit at the beginning of this week, but they've ramped up again. What's driving Iraqis to the streets?
Well, Anand, you're exactly right. Things have slowed down, but the level of frustration in Baghdad is huge right now. People are fed up with the government. Corruption, greed, and promises that Prime Minister al-Abadi has made for some time to bring others into the government to try and do away with this widespread corruption. But it simply hasn't happened. It boiled over first this week when protesters were able to push down those giant concrete barriers, force their way into the Green Zone, and for many of them it was the first time they'd ever been in that area. This is an area where government officials are, but also the embassies, including the massive U.S. embassy that really dominates the landscape in that region. Really, this goes back to the U.S. invasion some time ago. They took out a very strong leader. Saddam Hussein was that, among a number of other things, that really kept the sectarian discord together. And once he was gone, it really began to unravel. First, the U.S. put their version of a prime minister in. That didn't go well. So when al-Abadi came in, there was lots of hopes, lots of speculation that he would make the government more inclusive. That simply hasn't happened. Things have gotten worse. And now, of course, ISIL has a tremendous toehold in a large section of the country, and that is taken away from so much of what is going on now to deal with the unrest, not focusing on the terrorists that have moved into that region.
And Sean, what is the current U.S. involvement in Iraq?
Well, it's interesting because once al-Abadi came in, the Iraqi government made it clear they didn't want U.S. troops there anymore. They were viewed as occupiers, and Iraq wanted to be able to govern, rule its own country. There are about 4,000 troops in the country right now. Just about 2 weeks ago, President Obama announced he was going to send 200 more into that area. They're supposed to be working as advisors with Iraqi forces as they try and drive ISIL from that country. But we know that some special forces have been brought into that area, and the significance of that is they're going to be able to embed and fight with the troops as well. And from the U.S. side, sadly, they saw that unfold recently when a Navy SEAL, Charles Keating, was killed just a few days ago. Not the first U.S. troop killed recently, but certainly getting a great deal of attention for how the number of troops that just stormed the U.S. and Iraqi forces who were trying to keep ISIL at bay.
And Sean, what's the outlook for the country right now? Are we going to see more unrest?
Well, it's going to be interesting because Muqtada al-Sadr has tremendous clout, the Shiite cleric, and he who has really been calling for this civil disobedience, if you will, called for his supporters to go in and storm Parliament last week, which they did. They were able to drive Iraqi government leaders out, and they just basically ransacked the Parliament building. Now, the al-Abadi has got organized, and they control many of the main roads, the bridges leading into that country. Al-Sadr today is calling on his supporters to do protest outside of mosques rather than try and push their way back beyond those giant concrete blast walls. But it's going to be interesting to see exactly what happens, because Al-Sadr has tremendous clout in that country. And this past weekend, he vowed to, quote, destroy the government if it didn't take steps to become more inclusive. Now, al-Abadi, for his part, has been urging calm, saying if this country just goes further into chaos, it's going to be very difficult to try and retake Mosul and other key cities within that nation that they have lost. So it's a very, very touchy time, really very important time in Iraq's history. They're going to have to find some way to come together and continue to fight the one common enemy, ISIL, and find some way to be unified.
Thanks, Sean. That's CCTV's Sean Calebs reporting. Joining me now via Skype from Baghdad, Muaffaq al-Rubai. He is a former Iraqi National Security Advisor and Member of Parliament. Dr. Rubai, thanks for joining us. You're talking to us from Baghdad right now, and you're talking to us via Skype because, as you told us, you were unable to make it to our studio. Baghdad appears to be in some kind of lockdown right now. What is going on in the city?
Baghdad is in complete lockdown. The whole city is in a standstill. There's a frozen movement everywhere in the city because of the roadblocks and concrete T-walls, but in the main roads in Baghdad and in most of the bridges, basically to try to stop the protesters from getting into the international zone, which is called the green zone. These are angry protesters because their leaders, Muqtada Sadr, has ordered them to apply pressure on the members of parliaments and the members of the cabinet, trying to get some changes within the cabinet, in his opinion.
Now, there were protests this past weekend. Protesters, in fact, burst into that very secure green zone, which is the seat of the Iraqi government. What were those protests about?
The protesters were trying, or they have managed to storm into the parliament building. They were also managed to get into the Secretariat General of the office of the cabinet office, and they have managed to destroy a few furnitures and building inside the parliament. They were angry protesters instigated by their leaders, by Mr. Muqtada Sadr, who wanted to apply pressure on the parliament and on the government to get some of his so-called reforms applied.
Well, let's look at some of the reasons behind these protests. The Economist magazine tells us that there are staggering levels of corruption and incompetence, that the country lacks basic services, that officials have looted ministries that they are in charge of. Is Iraq close to a complete meltdown right now?
I agree. There is a widespread corruption, and this is not new. This is over the last 13 years inside the government, on the ministerial, deputy ministerial, and director general level. And the Prime Minister were asked several times to crack really heavily on corruption, but unfortunately, he has not carried any of this integrity, if you like, test for the former cabinet ministers, current cabinet ministers, and so on and so forth. There's also a lot of incompetence. I agree with the Economist. There is a lot of incompetence within the government because of the quota system, because some of these political parties and parliamentary blocs leaders are appointing ministers and the deputy ministers and the director generals to their liking. Basically, within the quota system, you basically killed any skills, any qualifications, any experience, and you appoint people according to their loyalty to your political agenda.
Dr. al-Rubai, Iraq was invaded by the United States. It was occupied by the United States. It saw years of war. What has all that achieved? I mean, it overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein, but what has it achieved?
I think we have achieved to get a democratic, parliamentary, pluralistic system. We managed over the last 13 years, since the American invasion in 2003. We have managed to change 3 governments and 3 presidents and 4 prime ministers and so forth and so on and so forth. And we managed to get general election, constitution, compared to the pre-2003 Saddam time era, whereby there was one person who is absolute dictatorship, rules everything and with iron fist policy.
Well, Dr. Al-Rubai, that is the optimistic scenario that you are unfolding there, but it's not just, you know, the breakdown in public order that we're talking about here. Large parts of Iraq still continue to be occupied by Islamic State. Oil prices have dropped. The country depends a lot on oil for its income. What is going to be the result? What is the impact of all this?
I believe we have managed to regain the initiative against ISIS. We got now back. We wrestled back more than 50% of the territories ISIS occupied in June 2014. We also managed to get through the most difficult year, which is the year 2015, financially because of the oil price reduction. And we have gone through this, and I think by the end of this year, hopefully, the oil price will regain some of its healthy sign, and we have managed to get now much more competent management of our financial system and our banking system, managing our debts, managing the high salaries of upper echelon in the government. So I think we are the bad days of the economic crisis is behind us.
Dr. Muwaffaq Al-Rubai, thanks for joining us, sir. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, is this current unrest just the latest in the legacy left by the US invasion? We're joined by a panel of experts. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the latest unrest in Iraq. Thousands of Iraqis have taken to the streets in protest against the current government. Joining me now is Raed Jarrar with the American Friends Service Committee. Yasmin Sami Al-Amiri is the politics and White House reporter for Rare Media. And Eric Gustafsson is Executive Director of the Education for Peace in Iraq Center. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Raed, let me start with you. We just heard the former National Security Advisor in Iraq, Muwaffaq Al-Rubai, tell us that Iraq is in a better place right now, that the political system works, that parts of civil society work, things like the banking system works, things like business works. You buy that?
I don't think he buys it either. I didn't really take his words very seriously today. I know Mr. Al-Rubai for a long time. And the fact that he can't leave his home to go to the studio to get this interview, I think is an indication to where Iraq stands today. Iraq is a country without a functional government. Iraqi government is one of the most corrupt governments in the world, according to Transparency International. Iraqis don't get any of the basic services anymore that were provided by their government historically in the last few decades. And Iraq is in a turmoil. The country is falling apart. There are sections of the country controlled by extremist organizations, sections of the countries that are seceding in the north. Other parts of the country are collapsing because of lack of services. So I don't think there is any sugarcoating that can go on the situation. It's a really bad situation, and it continues to deteriorate because there is no will or capability of the current Iraqi government to fix it. And it doesn't seem like there is any will by foreign governments like the US or Iran or Russia to stop their interventions in the country. So we're stuck in this cycle of violence and corruption.
Yasmin, what is your view? I mean, we heard Dr. Al-Rubai tell us there that Iraq is now a democratic state. They've changed governments 3 times, as he pointed out. But what is that worth to people when they don't have basic services?
Sure. I mean, look, I understand there's 2 fights that we're fighting, right, in Iraq. There's the political battle, and there's the real on the ground tangible things, which is people are not getting basic services, and we know that the unemployment rate is continuing to rise. Young people are completely disenfranchised, and day to day livelihood has been blocked by this massive corruption. But then on the other end of it, there's the PR battle. If you have the heads of government saying that it's all, plummeting and we can't do anything about it and we've lost complete control of our country, what are the people then meant to believe, and what hope do they have? So we can't fault the people in charge for saying we think that we're in control of our country, because that's their job. So we have to be very understanding for the fact that, yes, things do take time. I have a little bit more sympathy for the governments that are trying to rebuild. You cannot take a country out of years and years of crippling sanctions and being under a tyrant and then put them through a war and then rebuild a democracy in the eyes of a foreign government, as it has with the United States. So I think we have to give them a little bit more time. And yes, is it better than it was during the time of Saddam? It's relative. I mean, what maybe the services were there, but there was a deep sense of paranoia, and the people weren't safe.
I mean, if I can say something about this, I apologize. But like, I lived in Iraq before 2003, and I think that Iraqis lived under a dictatorship. It was a brutal dictatorship that did not allow any space for political dissent or freedom of expression. But Iraqis had functional public service, sector that provided to them healthcare and education and basic things. Now Iraqis still don't have a democracy. It's still a space where the ruling parties are not allowing for freedom of expression or democratic participation. And Iraqis lost all of the services that they used to get. So from my perspective, I don't really see it as a negotiable issue. The situation now is definitely worse than it used to be before 2003. Okay. It's not a comparison between Saddam and not Saddam. It's a comparison between a time that Iraqis ran the country and the time that a foreign invasion destroyed it.
Okay, let me bring Eric in. Yeah, Eric. Given the recent history of Iraq, are we perhaps being a little bit too harsh on the government here, seeing that it's trying to implement some development plans in the country? But when you look at what's been going on over the past few weeks, do you get the sense that this is a government in control?
I think if the government was in control and those that truly wanted the best for Iraq, then we would be seeing these reforms going through. We're not. If we were truly to honor the people of Iraq and the potential of the country, then there wouldn't be a green zone. But there's been this incredible isolation between the political elites and the rest of the country. So, while within the green zone you have the comfort of air conditioning and luxury, and the political parties are dividing up the ministries, and these become their personal fiefdoms, and they maintain these patronage networks of contracts to their to the party faithful, to their friends, but not really serving as institutions. I mean, what is needed, and I think what Rod is speaking to, yes, under Saddam, there are terrible things, but you still had institutions. And right now what we have is, it's more of a country of militias and fiefdoms rather than a functioning political system. It's not I don't want to diminish that there's been efforts, but right now, I mean, we're seeing the results. And meanwhile, Iraq is facing enormous challenges. We have an economic crisis, we have the security crisis, we have the humanitarian crisis. I mean, 10 million Iraqis need emergency humanitarian assistance. All of those challenges, and so what you need is a functioning political system to be able to meet those challenges. And look at the reforms, and there's too much of a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and we're not seeing the technocrats take over the cabinet as the Prime Minister wants to put forward, and these other efforts. And so I mean, I do think that there's a serious political crisis. Time is running out. There's an economic crisis. Iraq is burning through its oil reserves. And when that money runs out, it's going to be even worse. And meanwhile, the United States, the international community, I think, is too focused on ISIS, the Islamic State. And they're once again getting it wrong. They're not thinking about the day after the Islamic State, the day after ISIS. You go back, you turn the clock back to 2003, the U.S. Did not focus enough on the day after Saddam. we're about to make the same mistake and not looking at the longer-term needs of Iraq and honoring a plural society rather than, creating kind of these sectarian quota systems that I think is destroying Iraq.
But I think that's the point. I mean, I think that's the reason why when protests happen, you're then seeing the people speak up for themselves and say it's time for us to demand our rights, instead of being waiting to have somebody tell them this is your time to then demand your rights. These are Iraqis that are rising up and saying it's our time, and we want people that are based on a meritocracy representing us, not filling these blocks or quotas. Exactly, that's been discussed.
Right, right. The Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, was brought in as Mr. Fix-It. He was going to fix all these problems. He promised to improve government services, end corruption. That was the promise. What happened to him?
I actually remember being on this show the day that he was appointed, and I said the problems are not really a problem of choosing a new prime minister. It's a problem of changing the roots of the system. The foundations of the Iraqi political system is corrupt. The foundation is based on sectarian allocation quotas. It's based on ethnic and sectarian divisions. And the fact that Mr. al-Abadi came exactly from the same political party that ran the country, from the same political heritage, and the same political ideology that has been running the country, did not seem to be a good sign that he will be moving the country to another place.
To be clear now, the current unrest that we are seeing is not sectarian in nature, is it? It's not Shia against Sunni.
It's not, and that's exactly why it's happening. Iraqis tried multiple times in the last 13 years to say this system of sectarian quotas is destroying the country. It's causing divisions inside the country. It's giving cover to ethnic and sectarian cleansing inside the country, and we have to rethink it. We have to have a government that is not sectarian. There were successful attempts to vote for blocs that ran on non-sectarian agendas back in the day, and although those blocs won the elections, they were prevented from running the country. So what's going now is that Iraqis are trying to address the root cause for what's going on. The root cause of corruption, the root cause why we have ISIS and why we have Shiite militias and why we have Kurdish and Christian militias is not to go, the solution is not to go bomb them. The solution is to deal with the foundations of the corrupt system, and that's why these demonstrators are not sectarian. They are mixed, and they're demanding that we have a government that is not based on sectarian affiliations.
Eric, what do you make of the fact that a large part of the country is still under the control of Islamic State? That's an added problem for the central government in Baghdad. Is Iraq capable of defending itself?
Well, I mean, you're right. The second largest city by population is the city of Mosul, and it's still under the control of the Islamic State. We are seeing, we have been seeing some progress in terms of the fight against the Islamic State, but it's been very slow going. And I think that once again, the question is what happens after, even if there's success in clearing Mosul. So I think that ultimately, when you think about security, we're talking about human security. We're not just talking about getting ISIS out of Mosul. We're talking about ending the car bombs that are, a daily occurrence. I mean, Baghdad was this past month, according to the latest UN casualty reports, was one of the most dangerous cities to be in. So I think, once again, you have to address that. And meanwhile, there's a lot of people that are isolated from that and aren't affected. I mean, again, those that are within the green zone. So, ultimately, I think there has to be progress that benefits all Iraqis. And if there's a real separation, don't think Sunni Shia, think haves and have-nots. That's the real separation in Iraq today.
Right, and to address that, Yasmin, what needs to happen right now?
I think that one of the main things that's been alarming for me as somebody who covers foreign policy from the United States is that there is this overwhelming push by this administration to bolster the leadership that's in Baghdad right now. And I think a lot of Iraqis are saying this clearly is not working. Abadi's clearly not doing what he's supposed to be doing. And so why then do all of these confidence building measures of sending the Vice President of the United States to speak to Abadi and be very, bolster him up and to say that we have confidence in you when the country's obviously in crisis. And I think one very important step is to say, we acknowledge that this is not working. We acknowledge that you are in crisis, and we need to make other steps to remedy this that are less than band-aids that are trying to salvage in their waning months. Oh, we left Iraq better off than when we came in. And I think that's part of the issue from a foreign policy perspective.
I mean, on Saturday, after the protest, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad issued a statement. Once again, they made it about the fight against the Islamic State. Sure. And then they had this secondary statement, but it was very much like an afterthought about, yes, we need to also recognize the aspirations that the Iraqis have to be able to address corruption, to have public services. But it's like an afterthought. It has to be front and center. That's how you'll have progress.
How much does somebody tackle if in the remaining months of their term? I mean, it doesn't make sense to restart an entire battle where ISIS is exactly what's dominating headlines.
Yeah.
ISIS is exactly the primary fear of most people, and so it makes sense.
But I think, there is a very strong interest on the part of really global security, not just U.S. interests, but global security, to address the long-term needs of Iraq, to begin to build the stability, to be able to honor this. And there's so much potential that is being squandered right now, but to be able to honor what Iraq has to offer, and to be able to have a functioning political system that honors that.
Right. I've got 40 seconds.
But the issue is not really ISIS. ISIS is a symptom of the problem, and I think it is being used now, like even with the messaging of bringing troops back from fighting ISIS to deal with the demonstrators. It's trying to blame the demonstrators for deterioration. I think the root cause of the problem is building a united front in Baghdad, and that would help defeat extremism. It will help you reunify the country. So what's going on in Baghdad is really a better way to defeat ISIS than dropping bombs on ISIS.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Thank you.